Yeah, let's talk about fears. Yeah, let's talk about love. Yeah, I got fears, but I ain't got no love.
Okay, welcome back to Unsolved No More. Hey, today I got a great interview with Darlie Routier's sister. Now, anybody that's watching this, I'm sure you know who Darlie Routier is. She was convicted in 1996 of murdering her two boys, I think ages 5 and 6, and she has claimed her innocence and there was an intruder and so on and so forth. Um, I was contacted by Darlie's sister maybe a month ago in regards to she watched a video that I had done an assessment on about the case. And she wanted to kind of contradict some of the things that I had put out there. And she did it in a respectful manner. It's the only reason I got back to her. The people that are disrespectful, I don't even bother with. She was polite but stern, and I was intrigued. So I asked her if she wanted to talk about it on this show. And she said yes. So um, we agreed to do it, and you're going to watch the interview with her. Now, do I think that Darlie Routier is guilty? In my assessment, I said more than likely yes. And you have to remember when I'm doing these assessments for YouTube, they are totally different than when a family hires me or a law enforcement gives me their case and I have everything. Crime scene photos, and I'm able to look at it and give a proper assessment. For these videos, it's the bare bones. Media accounts, some photographs, some reports, but it's not in depth. Therefore, the assessments could be wrong. Listen, my ego is not big enough to say I'm never wrong. Um, I'm just not like that. It's what, even when I get cases from police or family members, I will say, hey, if more information becomes available, my assessment could change. There's nothing wrong with that. So, with that said, I'm going to let Darlie's sister, Danelle, speak for herself. And you'll see I don't interrupt much. I let her speak. And I will tell you what I think about the interview once it is over. So stay tuned, watch the interview, and, hopefully you'll gain something from it. Okay, watch. Okay, so what I want to do here is just kind of start first, I guess, by having you introduce yourself and let people know who you are and kind of what you represent.
Sure. So I am Danelle Stahl-Fugate. I am Darlie Routier's youngest sister. And I have been advocating for her majority of my life since I was about 14 years old. But more recently, once I kind of got my kids to a point where they're old enough to understand what's going on, and with the Innocence Project coming aboard, I knew that there would be a lot of publicity related to Darlie's case, and that eventually will impact them. So I decided to take that into my own hands and start preparing the general public and my children for reality of what we're fixing to go through. Darlie is hopefully going to be exonerated soon. And, with that will come a ton of media attention and skeptics and stories and articles and all kinds of stuff. And so if I can kind of get the head start and get everybody acclimated to what that was like for us 27 years ago, then they'll be more prepared. At least that was my thought process. So here I am on some social media platforms trying to advocate for my sister and trying to share the information that was misrepresented or things that were not known at the time that are known now. Just trying to clear up some of the misconceptions involved with her case, because the media just absolutely destroyed our family in the general public. And that was really hard to get past. It was almost impossible for my mother to ever get past. So I just wanted to have kind of the head start on it and write it the way I wanted it to be read instead of somebody else writing it for me. So here we are.
Well, that makes sense. Could we just go back to the beginning a little bit? You said this happened, I guess, probably when you were a teenager. What was your life like with Darlie growing up?
So Darlie was my oldest sister, and she was very much a big part of my life. We were a very close-knit family. We did everything together, every event, every holiday, almost every weekend. We were all together. After Darlie and Darren got married, they moved to Dallas, and we moved shortly after that. There was more opportunity in Dallas than there was in Lubbock, and my mom just couldn't stand to be away from her daughter. So we picked up and we moved to Dallas, and I cannot remember one time in my entire existence where I have seen Darlie be ugly to somebody, be rude in response to something. I've never seen her be violent. I honestly cannot remember her ever even spanking her boys. It's just, personality was very mild, very happy-go-lucky, bubbly, sweet, sincere, genuine. There was a lot of bad about Darlie. Like, really, that you could consider to be a negative connotation to Darlie would be that she was vain. But aren't we to some degree? I mean, we all want to be looked at and thought to be attractive. And so she definitely wanted to be pretty and wanted to look nice.
Yeah, what was the age gap between you guys?
Darlie is 12 years older than me. So she very much was like a second mother to me. She was always taking care of us and, helping around the house and coding us around. She was not just my sister, but she was my person.
Understood.
So it's really hard to see people. I was not going to cry. It's hard to see people believe such erroneous things about somebody that you love.
Yeah.
That deserves so much better. And that's the hardest part, because I know her and my family knows her, and we understand who she was and who she still is. And so to see these people, it kind of redistribute the information that she was an evil, self-centered, hateful, violent person is so far from the truth. It would be like your favorite female person in your entire life, somebody that would go to the ends of the earth for you and just about anybody else to help you in any way possible. It would be like that person being accused of killing their loved one. That's essentially the equivalent that I have to deal with.
Sure. And you were saying about the people redistributing the information that they got and how hurtful that is. And I am sure that I am part of that. And I'm sure that that's one of the reasons you originally reached out to me. And you did it very, lack of a better word, kindly. But I could tell your sternness as well. And I understood that. And that's the
Yes.
reason that I reached back out to you, because one of the things that I hate is people that point the finger and are so vile and evil when they don't know the person. They
Yes.
may hear things, facts, and they put it together in their brain and then they attack.
Yes.
I don't like that. I think a person needs all of the facts, and not just facts. You have to talk to the family members and friends who know them. And that is very important. And you brought that up.
Yes. And unfortunately, with Darlie's investigation, they did not talk to Darlie's family. They developed this theory. It started with James Cron, who was a consultant. He came in at like 6 o'clock in the morning, and by 6:30, he had Darlie pegged as the intruder. And from that moment moving forward, everything was developed with that in their brain. They never reached out to anybody that would have been a beneficial interview to Darlie's character. The only people they reached out to, now they kind of set out feelers to pretty much anybody that they could find in contact with Darlie's life. But the only ones they actually got a second interview with or wrote down notes on was the ones that had something negative to say about Darlie. They didn't follow up on any leads because to them, they didn't think those leads were important, because in their mind, they knew that it was Darlie. And that is how they got this misrepresentation of who Darlie was as a person. And that's really what allowed them to believe that she was capable of doing this, because there was a handful, I'm going to say less than what I could count on my fingers, of people that had anything negative to say about Darlie. And I mean, that should speak volumes, because when you're 26 years old, you're infallible and you do nothing wrong. And typically you're going to have more haters at 26 years old than you would at any other time. You've met a ton of people and you've made enemies along the way. And that's just how it is. Darlie did not have a ton of haters. Darlie's entire family supported her. There's not been one single family member that has said, oh, I don't know, maybe she did it. Not one. There's none. And that also speaks volumes to me as well. There was a lot done in that first 48 hours that was done blindly. They didn't even have a written statement from Darlie at that time. They had the initial comment that she made to Officer Waddell saying that she had been attacked, the description of the man. They had the 911 call. They had what she had told Officer Wallings, who was the second officer. Basically, it was just a description of what she remembered. And that was it. That was basically what they had. And when they tried to reconstruct and do a crime scene analysis, they really had some of those details wrong, and it really impacted how they processed everything else moving forward. And that's kind of why we are where we are right now.
Okay. If you remember back, I'm sure, because you're saying that people got things wrong during the assessments and stuff. You kind of watched at least a little bit of what I had to say, and you had brought up that I had gotten some things wrong. Do you remember what those things are off the top of your head?
Some of them.
Okay.
I had written a whole list of notes, and it's on my counter at the house. I know that one of the things that was brought to me, which made me first watch your coverage on Darlie's case, was the couch. And you were under the impression that there was not blood on the couch. And that was mentioned by Mr. James Cron. And I think that the reason that that is important is because there was a couple different details that were not included in his assessment. First of all, I think he may have been under the impression that she was on a completely separate couch. I don't know that he has ever verified which couch he originally thought she was on, but she was actually on the couch that was parallel with that back wall and the glass sliding door. And she also had her head closest to the TV, not facing away from the TV. So when you look at the pictures, there is definitely blood on that couch. She was laying on a pillow, and she also had a blanket. Her nightgown shows that the blood traveled over her left shoulder. She was lying kind of towards her left shoulder, and when her neck was cut, that blood traveled back and up over her shoulder. To me, that kind of supports and nullifies the idea that she cut her throat at the sink, because your blood doesn't run up and back over your shoulder. That would defy gravity. And it certainly supports the fact that she was lying on the couch when that initial wound was inflicted. I also think that a lot of people have this misconception that, you know, there's going to be blood on every surface as soon as you're injured. And Darlie did not have any arterial leads. Damon had no arterial leads. Devin did have an artery that was punctured, but it was very internal. And so that bleeding was not squirting out like you would expect on an arterial bleed, like you see in Hollywood. It's very much not like the Hollywood representation of a murder. When her neck was cut, she was lying down. There was an altercation. We know there was an altercation because of her bruises and the state of her physical being. The inside of her lips were all tore up like hamburger meat. They were just raw and kind of damaged, for a lack of better words. She had bruising under her chin, some cuts under her chin. She had a cut on her cheek. She had bruising all over her breast. She had bruising from her wrists down to her armpits. There was a lot of bruising that indicated she had suffered some kind of altercation, and the blood supports that probably happened on the couch. She did not ever say to Officer Waddell that she fought the intruder at the counter. That's nowhere on the 911 call. You cannot hear it anywhere on the 911 call. She does say that she was frightened or fighting. It depends on how you hear that comment. But even if it is, she was fighting. At this point, she's been attacked. We know she's been attacked. So she's able to understand that, okay, well, I was just fighting somebody off. It's not necessarily, I remember specifically the conflict or the engaging in a fight itself, because she really has no recollection of the actual attack. Her recollection starts when she hears Damon saying her name, pushing on her shoulder. She kind of sits up and sees this intruder or this figure receding from the crime scene and leaving through the kitchen. And at that point, she feels very panicked and anxious. She gets up and follows him out of instinct because she has no idea who this person is or what he's doing in her house. She doesn't know that she's been cut. She doesn't know that the boys are injured. Damon was just talking to her at her shoulder, so she has no idea. She follows this intruder. He goes out, drops the knife in the laundry room as he's leaving. She follows, picks up the knife out of instinct. When you have kids, you're always thinking to keep your kids safe first. And she did have a toddler. An infant. Drake was only 7 months old at the time. So that is kind of where things started for her. That's her memory of the actual attack itself. From that point moving forward, she comes back and puts the knife on the counter, turns on the light switch, calls 911, and yells for Darren. I think she had yelled for Darren as she was getting the phone. And, you know, there's kind of, before she dials, she has Darren already coming downstairs. Darren comes downstairs and starts assessing the situation. He does CPR on Devin. He tells her to get towels. What happened? Oh my gosh. He doesn't realize Damon has been hurt at this point. Darlie is on the 911 call. She's already provided towels to Darren. She is not medically trained, and she has never had any kind of first aid training. Instinctually to her, she wet towels, which actually could have been beneficial considering they were lung wounds. You want to occlude the air from getting in, but that was not intentional on her part. She wet them because she thought she needed to wet them. She gave them to Darren. She laid one over Damon after he had laid down. She told him, it's okay, baby. It's okay. Hold on, baby. Hold on. He is stopped in between the entry way into the living room and the living room, kind of right there at the corner. He laid down. She put a towel over his back. She's back and forth to the kitchen, to the bar, and to Devin. Darren does say in one of his interviews, it may be actually in the testimony, that he is doing CPR, trying to, on Devin, and when he blows into his mouth, blood comes up and is everywhere. And he also says that Darlie was helping him at one point with the CPR and tried to hold Devin's wounds closed, thinking it would help get him breathing again. But they had no idea he had actually bled to death, and there was nothing they could have done at any point. So there's CPR being performed, and she is there in touching distance to Devin, which could very logically explain the one little drop that's on her back. There's a couple other drops on her chest. I think there was a drop on maybe her left shoulder. I'd have to get my notes to tell you exactly all of those details, but you also have to remember that some of that blood that is the boys' transfer stains, because she was touching and handling the boys after they were bleeding. So there was the cast off that Mr. Bevel was so adamant about. If you watch the video, that's not a realistic posture for how somebody would stab somebody else. It's very exaggerated. He lifts the knife back all the way over his head, which is not realistic either. And he also, the way that blood drop falls, she would almost have to be completely parallel to the children when she stabbed them. Also, to go back to that Darlie called 911 while Damon was still alive. If she had done these things, would she have woken up Darren and called 911 while her victim is still alive? And would she have inflicted those wounds in such a visible place? I mean, her forearm and her neck, we live in Texas, that's pretty much always exposed. Even in the dead of winter, we're wearing short sleeve shirts. So if she was as vain as Greg Davis had implied, would she have inflicted these nasty scars to her neck and her forearm? I don't think so. I think it would have been a more subtle presentation of injury. You also have to remember that she had a gold necklace on at the time of the attack. And when you stand up, your necklace falls at the lowest point. And her necklace was in fact embedded into that wound. And if she was standing up when she cut her throat, that knife probably would not have even touched where that necklace was lying. Because she was lying down when she was attacked, the necklace was a little bit higher. When the knife went across her throat, it caught on that necklace and brought it into the wound. And it was definitely in the wound when the paramedics put the dressing on her throat. The one paramedic said that whenever he unclasped it in the ambulance and tried to remove it, Darlie kind of grimaced, and he could tell that it was painful for her. So he stopped removing it and just left it exactly where it was, taped up under her gauze. When they got to the ER, they brought her in. They took off that dressing, evaluated her quickly, and when the nurse saw the necklace, he just removed it from her neck. And at that point, the paramedic had already kind of dislodged it from where it was stuck in there. So they packaged that up and turned it over to the police. There is a nick in that necklace. It very well could have saved her life. The injury itself to her neck goes through the platysmus muscle. And I'm sorry, I'm word vomiting all over you. The incision that was left behind touches and goes through the platysmus muscle, which is that muscle that controls this front part of your neck and has a lot to do with how you can control the movement of your head. It went through that muscle and then touched the sheath that covers the carotid artery. Anatomically speaking, that sheath is thought to be 2 to 3 millimeters thick. If it had severed through that, there would be nothing stopping it from severing her carotid artery, and that would have been immediate death. The only thing that prevented that was that necklace. And that necklace shows the nick where it was definitely damaged in the attack. I don't want to derail your process here, so I'll let you ask me another question, and I'll try to keep it just to that question. I'm sorry.
No, you're doing fine. I understand your position, and so I obviously want to give you a lot of space to be able to talk about whatever you need. Why do you think that they're called? Going off of the wound that you just described, how did it get out there that it was a superficial wound?
That's a great question. So medically trained personnel understand that superficial is a description of location in medicine. Your superior vena cava is superior to your heart, but it's still deep inside your chest. So it is used in the doctor's note, which I also have to point out was dictated after Darlie was arrested. But the note itself is dictated to reflect the word that the injury is superficial to the strapnoid muscle, which is a deeper muscle that lies kind of parallel with the jugular vein, the carotid artery, and that vagus nerve that goes through there. So that is the only place in any documentation in her medical record that uses the word superficial. The idea that these wounds were superficial kind of stems from that documentation. They were close to the surface in most cases. I mean, this one to her shoulder was not superficial. It actually was a deeper stab wound. This one to her neck, actually, according to Dr. DeMaio, who is a world-renowned forensic pathologist, he says it appears as if it is a stab wound that was kind of a continuation. So it was not attempted as, a traditional cutting of your throat, but was actually attempted as a stab wound. And Darlie at that point was trying to fight off this stab wound. So instinctually, she was defending herself. And as she pushed him away, that stab wound was kind of drug across her neck. And that's what left the slash. And then the continuation could be from that shoulder stab wound, could be a continuation of this. It's kind of in a line. So it could very well be a continuation of that one motion. The forearm incision that they called an incision, an incised wound just means that it is longer than it is deeper, or it's wider than it is deeper. It depends on what verbiage you want to use there. But the incision itself was a little bit wider than what the depth of the wound was. And that arm was in motion when she was stabbed. So that would explain why it's a little bit wider, but it did in fact go to the bone, and it is on the outside of her forearm. So if you look at your forearm, it would be just like this. If I'm holding my arm up defending myself, it would be right there in that visible area. And for her to have done that herself, she would have had to use her non-dominant hand and turn her arm almost like, see my hands like this. She would have almost had to turn her arm like this and inflicted that incision if she were to do it herself. The wound on the neck is in zone 2. This is medical stuff. It's in zone 2, and zone 2, the definition of a deep wound is any puncture that penetrates through the platysmus muscle. According to the medical definition of a deep wound in zone 2 of your neck, that was a deep wound. That is the medical definition. That is just a fact. That is not anybody's opinion. That is fact. The other wounds, you can call them superficial if you're going to be measuring them in regards to other anatomical structures, but they're still stab wounds. The knife wound on her forearm would not have stopped had it not been for the bone. That essentially is where the idea that they were superficial came from. Toby Shook met with Santos, who was the doctor that was in charge of the surgery. Dr. Dillon was the resident that was in there. They did have some bleeding in the emergency room that required Dr. Santos to hold pressure on her neck. In that specific open wound, he held pressure until they could get everything scrubbed and ready to repair. If you know any medical professionals that know trauma surgeons, they will agree with me that that is well below what a trauma surgeon typically does. They are not going to hold pressure on a superficial wound if it is not life-threatening. You're talking about a trauma surgeon. They're not going to do that just for shits and giggles. Like that means that it was actually a serious wound. Dr. Toby Shook, when he spoke with them, he kind of planted those seeds that we think she's guilty. The police had already been up at the hospital and had been talking with some of the medical professionals, interviewing them while Darlie was still in the hospital. And so those seeds of doubt were already planted. Dr. Santos wrote up his report, but all of his information, including those initial notes that he wrote, handwritten notes, do indicate that it was a serious injury and that she was hysterical, and that all of the things that he testified to on the stand were kind of the opposite of what his notes reflect. The legal standard is your medical records, not the opinion that you say after the fact, because we are so suggestible as human beings. If I think somebody is guilty of something, I'm going to look at it, their behavior, what they did before, how they acted. I'm going to look at it very differently. Sure. If I think that they're innocent, then I'm going to look at it very differently. Kind of like whenever you're in an argument with somebody, most of the time you listen to defend yourself. You're not listening to try to understand things. In our brains, when we hear certain things, we're listening to try to justify our opinions, try to find supporting facts for our opinions. And we're not listening to understand really what we have been presented. So I think that's kind of where that came from. It is absolutely not superficial wounds according to medical definition. Superficial was only used in relationship to it being above the strapnoid muscle. That's it.
Yeah, I always find it very fascinating in my 20 years, 30 years of doing this, is that how you can get experts to look at a piece of evidence and they see completely different things. Now, sometimes they see completely different things because of the old mighty dollar. It depends on who they're getting paid by.
Absolutely.
Yep. I've been approached before about testifying for a defense. Hey, could you just say, that it looks like this? You're not lying because you said it kind of, but you believe this. Well, no, I'm not going to do that. My integrity is worth more than that. But I see it all the time, especially in high profile cases. I looked at cases where Cyril Weck, a great forensic pathologist, and Dr. Warner Spitz, who I feel is one of the best as well. And they'll look at the same evidence and they disagree. And it always boggles my mind because they're experts. They're not lay people who you would expect to disagree. Hell, we can't agree what color the sky is half the time, but you're experts.
Yes.
And it's almost like you overthink it to produce your qualifications or whatever it is to boost your ego, that you can't agree on what it is.
Yes, it's very much so two things I want to point out there. In Texas, anybody that has more information about a subject than the general public could be considered an expert witness.
That's how it is here too.
Yes. It's a little different now. You do have to have more to support your claim to be an expert, but back then it was not like that at all. Also, an expert witness is testifying to their opinions on the matter, what they think happened based on the information they're received. And all of our opinions are going to be different based on what we've been through in life, what we've experienced, what we've seen, what we've researched. Yep. So you're going to get a difference of opinions. And if you shop around and you ask enough people, you're going to find an expert witness that will support it. Yep, sure. Absolutely. And it is a business. Being an expert witness is definitely a business. Look at Tom Bevel. He has made this his now career, and he does so by finding cases that he can speak to. And if he is paid the right amount of money, he says what is needed to be said. Now, I don't think he would genuinely get up there and fabricate a big fat lie, but I think he looks for creative ways to interpret the blood spatter. And that's very dangerous because you can't be creative with those things. You have to rely on it for what it is and not try to stretch it to meet what you want it to say. It has to just tell you exactly what it is. And that's all you can get from it. That's it.
And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes
exactly.
you just can't interpret it. And
exactly.
that is sometimes a lot relevant with blood evidence. I mean, I've seen that a lot, specifically.
Yeah, it's very subjective. It's very subjective.
But why do you think then, I mean, do you blame the media or do you blame the investigators to the narrative that your sister is a murderer?
It is very much the perfect storm. Susan Smith had happened almost a year exactly prior to this. There was the media's conception that, it was so salacious that a mother would kill her children that they had really jumped in on that and thought, everybody wants to hear about the story because it is so tragic and it is so polarizing. And so the media had just started doing this 24-hour reporting thing. Crime stories were really kind of on the top of the production list. Like everybody was kind of jumping in on that side of things. And so this 24-hour reporting really fed into how people saw the case. We were placed under a gag order almost immediately after Darlie was arrested. So we couldn't tell our side of things. We also were trusting the cops that they were doing exactly what they were telling us they were doing, which was investigating the case. And in fact, they were not investigating the case, they were investigating Darlie. And because they put their energy and their focus into Darlie, they very well could have missed some significant things. Like things could have been completely overlooked because they didn't look for it. They sprayed the sink with luminol, but they didn't check for footprints anywhere in the house because they didn't think there was anybody else but Darlie.
But do you understand? They weren't really. I'm sorry. Do you understand why they thought that?
I understand that James Cron planted that seed, and then they started to develop things that fit that theory. Officer Waddell has said before that in interviews that when he entered that scene, initially he thought Darlie was innocent. Based on her behavior, based on what he walked in on, he felt like she was innocent. The next day, he comes back. He's told that they're pinning it on Darlie. They think Darlie's responsible for all of this. Then he comes back and he writes a supplemental report to include the fact that he told her to get down and help your babies, and she never did. That is absolutely not on the 911 call, and he did not speak to her after the 911 call. So did he fabricate that, or did he misremember that? Absolutely, because it is not in the 911 call. It's not anywhere in the 911 call. But that comment that he made, along with the comment that James Cron made that, well, there's no intruder here, along with Mr. Charlie Lynch coming in saying, well, that sink looks awfully clean. Those things together kind of laid the groundwork for a wrongful conviction. Mr. Cron saying that the blood is on top of the footprint, Darlie's footprint. Well, that shows that this was a staged crime scene. Let's not take into account that there was 9 people in and out of that house within the first 15 minutes of the crime. 9 people at least. Then there was 4 people that showed up early in the morning and walked through that crime scene. Mr. James Cron himself says that he took a hold of that wine rack and shook the wine rack to see if those wine glasses would fall off, and none of them fell off. Did he maybe dislodge some glass when he did that? I don't know. I mean, it's very possible. Did somebody walking through kick some glass? I don't know. It's very possible. Officer Waddell says that he tiptoed around the glass when he went to look at that door. But then they raised hell because Darlie's feet didn't have cuts on them, but he could tiptoe across the glass, but she couldn't have. She couldn't have walked around it. Also, there was no blood on that glass that was on top of Darlie's bloody footprint. Well, if you think about what that means, if you have fresh, wet blood on the ground, and in a matter of, if Damon died in a 9-minute time frame, that blood would not have been dried in 9 minutes. And she had supposedly broken the wine glass while that blood was still wet. If that blood had landed on top of her bloody footprint, there would be transfer blood on that glass. That blood would have been on that glass. No doubt about it. There was no blood on that glass. And that's documented and photographed. So that's not something that I'm making up. But it is very much supportive of the fact that that glass was kicked there during the investigation at some point after it had dried. And according to the CDC, blood takes about 60 minutes to completely dry. A drop of blood takes about 60 minutes for it to completely dry. There would have been blood on that glass, and there was no blood. And I'm not saying that they purposely contaminated the crime scene. It happens in every single crime scene, especially when there's a live victim still. Paramedics come in, they move stuff around to get where they need to be to provide first aid. It didn't go in our favor because it didn't save anybody, and it just kind of convoluted the crime scene. And what they used against Darlie pretty much all could be linked back to contamination of the crime scene. Also, I want to go back to the glass real fast. There was glass on top of the wine rack. So in the wine rack, there was a ice bucket that had tongs sitting on top of it. James Cron talks about it a little bit in his testimony. Doug Mulder asks him, is it possible for that glass to have jumped up and landed on top of that wine rack? And Mr. Cron can't even see the glass in the picture. He has to get his glasses out to look at it. Yet we're supposed to trust that he can identify fingerprints and see evidence clearly, all of that with his bad eyesight. There was definitely glass on top of that wine rack. And Darlie and Darren both say that there was glasses displayed on the top of the wine rack by that ice bucket. There was some like little glass tumblers, and then there was a wine glass. It was kind of just for display. It was kind of like a, you know, when you go into a furniture store and they have something set up to make it look like home, that's kind of what she did, just for show. That wine glass, when the intruder left and bumped into that wine rack, there was a rug right there that he could have tripped over. When he bumped into that wine rack, it knocked over that glass. That glass broke on top of the wine rack, and then the stem rolled off onto the floor where the rest of it kind of dissipated. But that's the only way that glass could have gotten on top of the shelf of the wine rack. There's no other way.
Okay, I want to go back to Officer Waddell and a statement that you made. So I'm going to say that this is probably in support of that officer, because you said that initially when he went in there, he thought that Darlie was innocent and then later changed his mind. Well, that's not uncommon. I mean, you go in and you look at things and you have a gut instinct, but you're trying to assess the situation, what you see. But then when you go back and you start looking at evidence and you're looking at facts, it certainly could change your mind. And it doesn't mean that anything nefarious was taking place. Now, it could, right, you know, but right, in support of him, I would say that, hey, that is not uncommon. Now, I don't know him as a person or anything like that. And if police mess up or they do a bad job, I pull it out. You know, I don't support that at all. The worst enemy of a cop is a bad cop. But I just wanted to point that out.
Yes. And I do want to say in his defense, I don't think any of these individuals are bad people. I want to make that very clear. I think they all were just doing a job, and they thought they were doing the best thing in that moment. They thought they were doing good. But because it was tainted from the very beginning, every decision after that will be linked back to James Cron saying that she did it. And the suggestion that this mother is guilty has now been planted in anybody that heard him say that. And those individuals that heard him say that were the individuals responsible for collecting evidence, processing the crime scene, all of that stuff. Before they even touched anything, Cron had told them he thought Darlie was responsible. Actually, he does not name Darlie within the first 30 minutes. He names an inside perpetrator. There was no intruder here, is what he said. Well, that leaves Darlie and Darren was upstairs with the baby. So take that for whatever you will.
Well, wasn't there some indication of a bread knife or something being used from the inside to slice a screen? Can you tell me about that?
Yes.